That sounds
I
good.
just want to raise the fact that Rick brought up Houston in his first story.
You know,
And wasn't lost on me that you brought up Houston with your intro. And anyway, I'll just leave it at that as an Angelino.
It was a coincidence.
I'm going to be a fair loser. I had the visor on the other day.
Yeah, I told Rick he should wear his visor again today, but he said yesterday was enough.
Next year.
Okay.
he might have had things thrown at him from the dais already.
Change of topic a little bit, and there will be some mixing of topic that we just discussed. So as you know, this is sort of part one of what we told you we would come back to you this year. So today what we want to talk about mostly were sort of the funding and financial related issues related to charter school, but we're not debating whether charter schools are good or not. We're mostly talking about what are the implications, especially of the fact that charter schools have a choice when it comes to retirement benefit. And what does that mean to us? So beside me here, I have, in case I have to phone a friend, depending on some questions.
There you go.
He's right there on my left. This is Scott from our legal office, who was key for this item. And the other thing too, I'd like to acknowledge, although I'm here today, this was really the work and the research of many people internally. We created a charter school task force internally involving people of all the different areas. So, and we will continue to work together as we come back to you in February with further information. So, what I thought I would do today is to maybe I just want to first frame, we talk a lot about charter schools, but I wanted to frame again and remind you the size of the charter school population and, how compared to the overall size of CalPERS today, it is still a small share. But before we get there, I don't know if you had a chance to look through the item, but we had attached a document that NASRA put together, and that sort of provided information on all of the states in California and whether or not charter schools are allowed, and if so, are they required, or is the participation in the retirement system optional? Then attaching this to the agenda item, we obtained this from the American Federation of Teachers. They allowed us to use it. They had put together this, what I think is a great way visually to see if you want the charter school map across the U.S. So if it's gray, that means those states don't allow charter schools. Green, like we're us in California, charter schools are allowed, and participation in the system, in the statewide system, is optional, and then blue is mandatory. So it's interesting, if you look, it's pretty close to 50-50. There's about 23 states for which it's mandatory, 20 for which it's optional. So it's interesting, it's all over the place in the nation. It's about 50-50. We are one of the states for which it's optional, and it has implications. Today we have and again, this is as of June, because it changes regularly. The numbers we got as of June was there were 1,243 charter schools that were actively in operation in California. And then you also have other information about all of the ones that closed. So it's almost, if you look historically, there has been about 1,900 requests for charter school creations, 1,243 active, about 600 have since closed. What we want to show you here, you kind of have two charts. The one on the left kind of shows you the historical number of active charter schools. The red line you see here, in case you did not know, there's actually a limit in law as to how many charter schools we can have in California. In 98-99, that limit was set at 250, and the charter school law says that each year that limit increases by 100. So today, the cap is 2,050. And we have about 1,200. So you can see where we are. So the red line shows you kind of the maximum allowed. And then we want to show you, the blue are the ones that elected CalSTRS, the orange are the ones that elected not to provide CalSTRS benefit. So you can see that we're starting to see a slight increase in trend lately, as we showed you back in June. And then if you look at only the charter schools and you kind of say, what's the percentage of them not electing CalSTRS? Although we've made a lot of, we've been focusing lately on the increasing trend, it's interesting to note that just in the late 90s, 30% of charter schools were not in CalSTRS. then we start to see a trend of more and more of them electing CalSTRS. And then lately, we're starting to see the trend going the other way again. But it's a trend that has kind of fluctuated over time. So it's interesting to, want to say something, Dana?
I
be
do,
the
but
same thing. It might be the same
Let
thing,
Sharon
so.
go first. Go ahead, Sharon.
I guess I wondered, do you think there's a correlation between that and, funding and increased contribution rates?
Yes,
in
and we had
14?
some discussions with some stakeholders and other group, and what we're hearing, especially from discussions we had with some staff at the Charter School Association, what they're hearing is a lot. I think now some of the reasons why they're not electing CalSTRS is, in a lot of cases, related directly to the increased contribution requirements. I think before, when it was 8.25, I think it was much easier to bear. I think now some of them, when they're saying it's going to go to 19.1, I think it's probably pushing a little bit more toward the non-CalSTRS option.
I'll leave my other comments till later.
The next thing I want to show you was the number of active members, just to help you see how large it is. We're talking about increase in number of charter schools not electing CalSTRS, but how big is it for our population? So if you look today, we obtained a lot of this information from the California Department of Education. They have on their website information about full-time equivalents for all of the schools in California. So we were able to massage that data, go through it, and basically we're able to identify that of all of the charter schools not with us today, we're talking about close to slightly over 3,000 active members that, if they had elected CalSTRS, would be with us today. So we're talking at about close to 1% of our membership that you could make an argument we have lost because they elected not to join CalSTRS. So today, the total charter school population represents close to 7% of our population, and 1% of it is actually not with us. The other 6% are. So that's, when we talk about the financial impact, like how are employers impacted by the fact charter schools have a choice, right now it's still a small impact, 1%. But it's been increasing. We'll keep an eye on it, but it's still, even if it were to double or triple, keep in mind it's still a small percentage of our population.
Sharon?
This might be a question for you, Scott, because I'm curious, like when you go back to that previous slide, the map of the U.S. and the optional versus mandatory election into the state retirement system, what I guess I'm curious about the history as to, why certain states had it be mandatory that charter school teachers went into the state system, and why in California or other states it was optional. I mean, can you give us just I don't want a huge history lesson, but maybe just a brief, why is it optional in some states and mandatory in others?
I don't know is the answer. Okay. I do know that we were, I believe, the second state to start charter schools back in '92, I believe. So we were one of the first states to start it, and just in the Charter School Act, we provide that option to either participate or not. So why other states chose to make it mandatory or optional, I have not delved into that question. I can try to look into that for you. Yeah, I'd be happy.
Getting that information back. Just, again, we don't have to get into too much of the weeds, but just a general flavor of, because that just seems, it was interesting for me to go to NCTR and talk to other trustees around the country. And we always, talk about these issues, and it's just fascinating to me, like why is it mandated some places? And
absolutely.
We tried also. We've looked. There are several studies that actually came out recently about charter school, and we've been trying to get some of that information. It seems to be harder to find the reason behind it. It's interesting to note, and it was noted in the agenda item, there's actually one state, that I think Delaware, that started originally with the optional participation, and they realized it was not working, and they changed it to mandatory. But we can try to research that a little bit more, and if we can find it before February, then we'll try to report back maybe as part of the item.
That would be terrific. Thank you.
So in the item, so what we want to talk about, so charter schools have a choice not to, when it comes to retirement benefits. And the point we wanted to make here, and we made the point in the report, is The first question we were trying to answer with respect to charter school and the impact on the funding of our system was, what happens when a charter school elects to provide benefits not with CalSTRS? What does that mean to other employers? What are the implications to the funding of our system? Now, the key thing to remember here is, so in the previous item, we talked about the impact of declines in membership. The main thing you have to remember is the size of our unfunded actual obligation, what it is today, is not impacted. Each time a new charter school is created, if they elect not to participate in CalSTRS, it has no bearing, no impact on our existing unfunded liability. But what it does, because we collect contribution as a percentage of payroll, to the extent that new charter schools elect not to be in CalSTRS, and to the extent we lose teachers that would otherwise be with us, our payroll base, our revenue base is now lower. And what it means? To pay for the same unfunded liability, we have to increase contribution rates. And what we mentioned in the agenda item today, you could make the case that if charter schools were all in CalSTRS, we think our payroll will be, our population will be about 1% higher. If that was the case, we're talking about, again, the impacts are, I think you could view them as minimal. Contribution rates would be about 0.17% lower. Now, if you look at it another way, if we weren't going to lose an additional 1% of our membership going forward because more charter schools are not electing CalSTRS, we would need to raise contribution rates for employers by 0.17%. So each time a charter school elects not to be in CalSTRS, it impacts other employers. If we ever saw a 10% decline, again, that would take drastic changes. We're talking about 10 times more charter school than we've seen historically not electing CalSTRS. We're talking about a 1.7% of payroll. So the risk here for us as a system is if we start to see a decline in membership that prevents us, prevents you as a board to raise the contribution rates to the level that they need to be, it could become an issue. But based on what we've seen so far, based on the charter school population, we don't see this as a threat, but I think we need to keep an eye on it. I think so our plan is we'll keep monitor to see what the growth is. And if you wish, we could continue to report to you on a regular basis with respect to how many we're seeing each year. But if you look at historical trend, we mentioned in the previous item as it would take like a decrease in membership of about 62,000 over 5 years to start, preventing you to set contribution rates high enough to reach full funding. We're talking about 20 times more members in charter schools than we see today. That's a huge increase. So don't think we need to worry about it right now, but I think we need to keep an eye on it. The other thing we wanted to talk about, so because we collect contributions as a percentage of payroll, if we have a charter school that first elects CalSTRS and 5 years later closes down, there was some concern about what happens at that time. Are we shifting costs from one employer to the next? And what we wanted to kind of show you graphically, at the beginning I showed you we had about 600 closures of starter school the last 20 years. And what I wanted to show you here, it's interesting to note that about 50% of those charter schools never elected CalSTRS in the first place. So then we actually find out that in about 5% of those cases, just over 30 charter schools actually, after they close down, they reopen as traditional schools being part of CalSTRS. So what we've done for this analysis, we were more traditional. So we've seen that about, I think in 31 cases, about 5% of the closures. So what we did for our analysis is we wanted to focus on the other 50%, the other 300 charter schools that initially joined CalSTRS and closed. We were concerned, what happens to them? Is there a shift in cost? And this is where it's not always, black and white. It's kind of this gray area because it's hard to, what do you mean that there is a shift of cost? So today you can make the case that each employer is responsible for a share of the unfunded liability based on their payroll, because that's how we collect contributions. So when a charter school closes down, before you start saying there's a shift of cost to all other employers, you have to ask yourself, where did the students and teachers go? Did they remain within the CalSTRS system? As long as they remain within the CalSTRS system, I think we can say that there are no shifting of costs. And in fact, this is not much different from just a regular traditional school that would just, maybe the district decided to close it to move the teachers and students somewhere else. You know, this happens all the time. So as long as, if a charter school just simply closes down to reopen and the students and teachers are reabsorbed, this is pretty much the same. So what we tried to do, we tried to collect some information. We contacted CDE, we contacted Charter School Association. We could not, no one seemed to have a source of being able to track down kind of what happens after the closure of a charter school. So we decided to rely on some of the data we had internally. So the good thing with a lot of the data we collect, especially the actuarial data, because we have 1 year snapshot of where people are, it actually allows us to track which employer they work for. And it was interesting. So we look at all the schools that closed, and we said, okay, what happened to them a year later? Are they still with us? And in 60% of the cases, they were still with us, with a different employer. So when you look at this, you can make the argument that in most cases, it looks like that the teachers were reabsorbed somewhere else in our system, and maybe you can make the case that the students followed them as well. And then what we were not sure is what happened to the other 40%. And what was interesting here as well is we noticed many of them took a refund of contributions, which you could make the case maybe they just elected to leave the teaching profession. Then we spent a bit more time looking at the other 32%, and what we realized is the vast majority, more than 80%, had actually very little service. And when you go back to what we told you before, you know, you keep hearing all the time that 40% of new teachers don't make it past the first 5 years. It's interesting that this is right in line with this. So we're not, you know, it's impossible for us to tell because we don't have a way to contact these teachers and asking them, and I don't think we want to go through that process. But based on all of this, to date, we don't think that we, you know, if we have seen some cost shifting to other employers, we don't think it's there. I don't think we have seen, you know, I don't think closures of charter schools have resulting in cost shifting. So we can keep monitoring this, but if we're worried about closures of charter schools shifting costs to other employers, it's not been happening. So
if you could go to the slide where the, there you go.
This one
No,
here?
where people took their money. I find it interesting that 32% have left that money in. But we know they've not gone to work for another school. So that kind of made me think that we already know that there's a huge disconnect with our younger members about CalSTRS. And I wonder how many of them actually know that they have money sitting in CalSTRS. I mean, there could be a number of them that are waiting to get hired in a traditional school, and that's why they've left it in. I'm curious of how many could possibly not even know they have contributions in it because they didn't even realize they had a pension system. And that gives me great pause that there might be people out there that don't have a clue. And it's not like we can get a hold of them or anything, but I mean, it frightens me to a certain extent.
So the last thing I wanted to talk about today was, so in the item we talked about, you know, what's the impact of charter schools, not that I think CalSTRS or other employers. We talked about if there are cost shifting when schools closes. We don't think so. Then kind of the last funding aspect with respect to charter school, and this here it's key also to realize that this applies to all the schools, is if we want to be able to reach full funding, you know, to secure the benefits, first, as a board, you have to be able to set the contribution rates to the level they need to be. And we've made great stride with the funding plan, but the other probably even more important steps, we have to make sure we collect those money. And what we made the point in the item, and I just want to mention again, and Robin, right after this, actually has an item talking about collections. I plan to go real quick here. We can have a more in-depth discussion after. the key point I want to make here is we have a lot of processes in place that are the same, whether they're for charter schools and traditional schools. We have a lot of proactive steps that we take, whether they're audits, we monitor payroll, we monitor contributions coming in. Anytime we see shifts, either especially down compared to prior months, we investigate. So we try to be very proactive in making sure we collect contributions. And then, as was mentioned in the item, we have certain authority by statute, if needed, to go to the state controller. We've never had to exercise that authority in the past, but it is there. As part of the item, one of the questions we tried to answer as well, if it ever came down to it, would the chartering authority be ultimately liable? It is unclear when we look at some of the statutes. I think the chartering authority would have to fail in a lot of its oversight duties, which seem to be very unlikely to be the case. So the key point here is we've always been able to collect the contributions that we are owed. I think Robin had a mention of one employer right now for which we are in the process of trying to collect. But we have good processes in place, and they're the same whether it's charter school or traditional schools. One thing that doing this review, and it's mentioned in the next item as well, we have seen there are places where we could improve processes to be more proactive, and they're mentioned in the agenda item, and we will be looking at those to see how can we better identify ahead of time charter schools, whether they're traditional or charter, or charter, whether they're in financial distress or not. So, because I think that's the key here. We want to make sure we collect the contributions, and if we see warnings at a school, maybe in financial district, we need to be proactive and get to them as soon as possible. So with this, if you have any other questions on the item, I'll be happy to answer them. But our plan right now is to come back in February to kind of try to look at some of the other aspects of charter school, the chartering process, what's our role, and what should be our role in the future. And probably after the February item, we're probably going to be looking back to you for directions as to what do you want us to do with all of this? What steps should we take when it comes to charter schools and their option to elect or not elect CalSTRS?
So, David, I know that we worked with the Charter Schools Organization and with AFT on a lot of this information. But when we start talking about schools that are distressed within California, I think we need to bring it back more locally. And I think our constituency group, CFT, CTA, they have an awful lot of information, and because of the organizing they're trying to do with charter schools. So I know that they have some pretty good insight on some of these schools that might be in distress also, through some of the organizing they're doing. And I'll just say, I happen to be the CTA board member for a charter chapter who had a school declare bankruptcy so they didn't have to negotiate. They weren't necessarily in distress, but once they declare bankruptcy, if they had been our members, and I don't know if they were or not, I mean, it can turn at a dime, and those organizations could be really helpful. All right, Lynn?
Thank you. And thank you for the report. Really appreciate it. I had two questions. One, I was wondering if there was a forum or a venue for CalSTRS to meet with new charter schools to describe and outreach to some of the benefits that we have.
So that's one of the things we're going to be looking at for February is because right now I think charter schools we don't have a way to reach out to them before they are created. We usually reach out to them after the fact to let them know how we work, how to report information. I think this is one of the questions that will come back to you in February is should we be more proactive and get involved in the chartering process, or maybe just at a minimum maybe have on our website and make it and put the word out there that, maybe put together a charter school package about the benefits of providing CalSTRS benefit. I think we can talk about it more in February. I think that's probably one thing that maybe we want to consider as a system to make sure that when they go through that process, that they understand what it means to be part of CalSTRS. Because I think right now we've been trying to see what is out there, and we haven't found pretty much anything about CalSTRS. I think the only thing that they really see are where contribution rates are heading.
Right. I think that that could potentially be very helpful. And then just to follow up on the question that Sharon had earlier, has there ever been any discussion or legislative attempts to allow the charter school teachers, employees to determine or select their retirement option? Or is it only allowed, or only the charter school operator is allowed to do that?
I think right now, and then Scott can jump in, but right now it depends how the charter school is created. So the chartering process is different, whether it's a conversion from a traditional school, because when it's a conversion from a traditional school to a charter school, the employees have to vote on it as well. And if you don't get 50% of the vote, then it fails. But when it's a brand new charter school, it's done at the population level, I think.
Yeah, so David's correct on that. When it's conversion, you need 50% of the teachers from the traditional public school to approve the petition in order to become the charter school. However, when you're creating just a petition to begin with, it's one of two ways. You either need 50% of the parents of the estimated kids that are going to be in the charter school to sign off on the petition, or you need 50% of the estimated teachers that are going to be teaching at the charter school. So there's a little bit of, I guess, say there in the teachers for whether or not they're going to elect to have to participate in CalSTRS, because the petition needs to then state that.
Okay.
I think there'd be some real serious equity issues to address if you've got an employee that opted for a DB and took a 19% employer contribution, and then you had a DC plan with employer contribution of 3, 5 at most. It would be a very chaotic funding approach.
So this is where probably we could, if there's a way for us to be more, to have a way to be engaged or provide more information in the chartering process. Because right now, we don't really know what if it's a conversion. The good thing, which we mentioned the item, to date, each time we've seen a conversion, they've pretty much elected CalSTRS. So what we're seeing right now is when it's a non-conversion, this is where we see a greater proportion not electing CalSTRS. And in those cases, maybe we can find a way of providing information about CalSTRS and its benefit to help in the process. But teachers technically may not have a say at all.
Okay. Thank you.
I think you bring up a good point on whether it's conversion as a turnaround type of tactic, or if it's something that's totally independent of that. Michelle, do you have records at the CDE of whether those charters or does the state board have records of charters that have just opened or their conversions? Is there metrics around how they've been opened?
We actually have this internally. We actually were able to get a lot of the information from the website. So there's been just over 200 conversions only.
Not very many.
So basically the vast majority, over 1,000, were brand new charter schools.
Thank you. All right, Karen?
Brand new, okay. Appreciate the report. I was just thinking about the whole issue of charter schools. It's so immense, so big. There's so many components to it. And on Dana's point, I just wanted to make sure that you're reaching out to various stakeholders and just trying to get all the information you can. And I think as we talk as a board, if we can concentrate on maybe a few issues that we want you to delve into or dig deeper with, I think that might be better than just trying to do a little bit of a lot of things. So.
Harry?
I think over time, maybe February or something, I'd love to be able to have a discussion about the pros and cons and the risks and the opportunities of potentially pursuing a legislative approach to, you're a public school employee, whether you're regardless of what the title of the school is, how you label it, where it's held. But if you're an employee of a public school, you're a member of CalSTRS. If that's our mission, to ensure the retirement security of California's educators, I think there's overwhelming evidence that the best way to ensure that is the type of pension plan that we offer. It's there's a price to that, but we either believe that or we don't. And then as it relates to exposure, I think there's been recent legislation on new employee orientations, and there might be an opportunity, I'm certainly not the right person, I don't think we are, to find out, is there an opportunity for the CalSTRS story and message to be part of new employee orientation, which I believe is now required in all school districts, regardless of labor management relationships, where they're healthy, that always happened anyway. But when they've been strained, those orientations have always been kind of management without labor. And I think the new legislation requires there to be that new orientation, and part of new orientation certainly should be speaking about the CalSTRS benefit, the financial cost to the employer, what employees are paying, and how the benefit of that, especially if you choose education and teaching as a career. So there might be some synergy there to think about. Maybe we can talk about that in February or, yeah.
Paul?
Thanks. Again, excellent report, very, very useful. It seems to me that there's a few sort of separate questions here. We would like teachers who are part of charter schools to be members of CalSTRS, both because we believe the CalSTRS retirement benefit is the best for them. But we also want them there because they're an extra member upon which we can collect money to pay off the unfunded liability. And yet you say that when a charter school joins CalSTRS, the unfunded liability doesn't change. So what it does is it makes it less risky for us to pursue our funding plan. And it potentially reduces the burden on other schools, which, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think there's a distinction there then, and it might be interesting to try to understand that. A distinction between wanting charter school teachers to be members of CalSTRS because we think it's a great retirement benefit, and wanting them to be members of CalSTRS because of the funding risk reduction that comes from that. And those are different numbers, right? I mean, the normal cost is the first one, and the full 19% is the second one. And, I would love the full 19%, but what you also talked about at the very beginning was that there might be a connection. I think it was Sharon's question or somebody's question at the beginning. There might be a connection between the increasing costs and the reduced opting in by charter schools to CalSTRS. So I just think it's another piece.
Absolutely. Ready, any further speakers? Jennifer? Oh, hang on.
Can I ask one? I'll say one, sorry.
Sure.
But just, I guess my one comment is this topic, I think I'm looking forward to February, because I think we can give you more direction. I'm not sure we'll need reports all the time. I think this is kind of a new topic, so we wanted to, but I think that the topic came up really it really is a fiduciary topic, and I think, some of us are teachers on this board, but we recognize some of these conversations really are about looking at our membership, and is that membership increasing or decreasing? Why is that? And potentially, how does that impact our funding for the future? So I really do appreciate the work that your team's doing, and I look forward to getting more information in February, because it is something that certainly, as we spend time with other teachers and other funds, it's an issue for our funding. So thanks.
Jennifer?
I appreciate the comments that the board has made in regard to working with some of the constituent organizations, because some of our organizations have quite a bit of context and can be helpful in helping staff to understand the process. If I could take some of my time and answer Lynn's question before I get to my other time. when there is an election for a charter, it's not specifically to participate in CalSTRS or not. So I think understanding the context of the election is very important. It's whether or not to have a charter, right? That doesn't mean that educators or even parents are going into it specifically only focusing on the CalSTRS option, because realistically, most folks have no idea. And that's probably not the focus of most of the conversations. So I think if the conversation were to be specifically about whether or not to elect to participate in CalSTRS, that's a very different conversation, but those are not, it's not necessarily the conversations that take place at the local level. And then one of the interesting policy questions that we've been starting to chew on is whether or not members really understand if they're going into a charter school that's not covered with CalSTRS. Do they understand that's the case? And if they've been pulled from a traditional public school, they are a CalSTRS member. So to what responsibility does CalSTRS have to ensure that that member has retirement security? So I think that's a broader question you might want to consider chewing on. You're not notified as an entity if one of your members goes into a non-CalSTRS covered employer, but they still may be working in education, and they may at some point come back to a CalSTRS covered employer. What kind of notification should they receive to let them know you can buy permissive service credit? How much would that cost? So that's a more complicated, nuanced conversation that might need to happen in the context of you're trying to provide your members with retirement security and education. The other question that we might have is under the statute that was noted that gives you the ability, should you need to, go after an employer, what would the context be if the entity was a nonprofit and the state controller actually paid funds directly to the nonprofit as opposed to a county? Because if you would try to intervene to take resources that are owed to you, but the controller paid the funds directly to the nonprofit, how would you then go after those funds if they're no longer paying them to the nonprofit? So it gets a little complicated, but it's not, I want to make sure you understand there might be instances where you may not be able to go after that funds that you might want to consider exploring.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes.
Brian Ha with the California Federation of Teachers. We want to thank and we applaud CalSTRS staff in engaging in this project. And I also want to echo Madam Chair's comment about using the organizations like AFT, CFT, and CT as a resource. We look forward to working with you, and any information we can be able to provide, we will be happy to assist with every step of the way. Thank you so much for this work.
Thank you, Brian.
Pat Geyer, retired teacher. One of the things I see and wonder about is that more and more people don't go into one career for their total working life, that they may have a variety of jobs, and that this would be an impact on CalSTRS because maybe you're going to teach for 5 or 6 years and you don't get vested, and then you go on with something else, and how this would impact it. I think it's something we need to think about for the future. Thank you.
Are there any further questions or any speakers? All right, let's take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 20 to 11. Thank you, David. All righty, thank you very much. Robin, we're going to turn it over to you.
Well, I took David's lead on the call a friend and doubled it, so I asked Scott to stay with me here, and I asked Cassie Mallet-Beck, who is our contributions area manager, to join me here with this discussion. So if you have questions about employer relationships, we'll have that expertise right at the table. So, and again, somewhat in contrast with what David presented in terms of the risk report, we're going to start on a positive note, because we really haven't had to have a lot of engagement with financially distressed employers in terms of remittance of contributions. So what we've done in this slide deck is to give you more visibility into the kind of analysis we do to determine areas where we have potential issues in terms of collecting our contribution revenue. And then in the next steps at the very end, the path forward, we'll talk more about how we have begun to engage with others on tangible processes for us to address a situation where we aren't successful in collecting contributions. So, but I want to start with just the normal process in terms of the revenue analysis, the contributions analysis that we do in the organization. And this is a representative of the good work that staff are engaged in on a daily basis. So we'll start with some information on our cash. So this is fiscal year 16-17 data. And this shows over the course of the fiscal year, the entire fiscal year, the patterns of inbound contributions. So we've talked a lot about the volume of inbound contributions and the split between members, employers, and the state. And what this shows you is how that looks over the course of a fiscal year. You'll see a dip in August, which is really representative of July payroll, logical. Many schools are not in session in July, so you would see that dip. You also see a dip in January, which is representative of the fact that there is a lull in a transition over the holidays. So again, this really reflects the changing dynamics of those contribution patterns over the course of the full school year, and it's really aligned with the school year calendar. What we do on the next slide is we break it down for a quarter so you can see more on a daily, weekly basis what the flux looks like. So again, as you drill through the data, because the numbers are so large, when you stand back and look at it on a full year basis, you don't see the blips day by day or month by month. And most of the money is received by CalSTRS on the 6th business day. By the 6th business day. We also get some money by the 15th business day. And then there are additional contributions coming in for late reporting or supplemental reporting, cash balance program. And so those are the variations you see as you look at those details. Then on the reporting side, we give you 3 years of data here, just so you can see, again, these are credible. This is really a pattern of credible compensation and contribution rates on top of that. So the variations by year are attributable not only to the change in contribution rates, but also to increases potentially in credible compensation that would cause you to see the difference in the amounts remitted. But again, a pattern that looks like a school year. Nothing in particular that causes anyone to ask any questions about that. In this particular example, 16-17 is higher because credible compensation increased 6%, because the employer contribution rate increased, and because member contributions increased. So in all 3 cases, we had a change in the dynamics. This next slide takes that reporting for 16-17 and tries to show how much is timely. So the orange line really describes, of all of that contribution reporting we're getting, how much of it relates to the payroll period for which the report is intended. And then the green and the purple line reflect the reporting that is for some kind of prior period, whether it's within the current fiscal year or for what we call a prior year adjustment. And you'll see the majority of the reporting is for the current fiscal year. So again, just drilling through that data to show you that the variations occur, but they're a very small percentage of what we're getting on an ongoing basis. This is showing a different view as you drill through. So although on that macro level, it looks like everything's fairly consistent, if you take an individual school district, you begin to see variations. The drop in September of 15, so this is going across 2 fiscal years, is what we would call a normal drop due to seasonality. Then you get to the next September, we have potentially what might be a normal drop, except it went to 0. So that caused us alarm. What was happening? And that lasted through January. So what happened at that point in time? And this is how we identify potential problems. So staff got on the phone with the report source, the county, as well as with the school, to find out what was happening. And in this particular situation, there was a technology transition. And the technology transition caused there to be a disconnect between the district and the county, and the ability for the county to bundle the reporting such that it could be sent to us.
So Robin,
Yes.
would we call the county first? Because they're
Yes.
the reporting agency?
Yes, so
and then-
that's our
and then-
first
And then
step.
get down, okay.
And in this particular case, we've been in dialogue with both
With
parties.
both, absolutely.
With both parties. So.
And they did not bother to contact us to say, we're having technical difficulties,
Well, we're trying to be proactive.
They were several months, though. They knew that they weren't remitting, they should have been.
Well, so in this particular case, they gave us cash. So they were working hard to make sure that we had the cash. We just couldn't validate or settle the cash because
it.
we didn't have the
Got it,
reporting.
got it, okay.
And I don't want to give you the impression that we don't have a collaborative relationship. Sometimes it's a matter of timing.
Okay.
We can see something as soon as the file drops.
Right.
And we want to be ahead of the curve.
Okay.
So, again, these are the tools that we use as an organization to make sure that we understand why there's a problem. So we had a couple of indicators here. We had unsettled cash, we had a gap in reporting at a school district level. Although if you looked at the report source overall, this happens to be a very large report source, we wouldn't have seen necessarily a measurable fluctuation. But because we go down to that LEA level, we can see these kinds of things. And so this just gives you that particular illustration. Obviously, we picked one so you could see that there was a gap that we could identify, and then we can explain the reason for the gap. This lays cash over contributions, and the reason I wanted to show you this is because of the differences in timing. So you might look at December, for example, and see that the reporting is high and cash looks like it's less than what was required. But the cash was for the December or the November report period, and the December reporting was for October. So you've got a timing difference. And so that's part of why this is tough, is because there are gaps in timing. So again, this just explains the complexity that goes with the analysis. Not that we can't manage it, but because there's not alignment between the cash and reporting, we have to offset as we're doing the analysis. And again, we have developed tools so we can do that, so we don't take these differences as something that is unusual. We understand it, we just have to unbundle it. So, like I said, that was more about how we identify differences. In terms of what we're doing now in cases where we do have events that cause us not to be able to collect the contributions that we think are due, is we're working on establishing better ongoing relationships with the California Department of Education, with the State Controller's Office, with FCMAC, which is a branch of the Department of Finance, to make sure that we understand their work in terms of auditing school districts, understanding requests from county superintendents for districts that appear to be in financial distress, so that we understand the funding paths and how to have effective conversations. I can tell you that in the instances where we have had lapses in contributions, most of the time, a communication with the reporting source is all that's needed to get the contributions remitted. So most of the time, we're able to have the reporting source understand their responsibilities to CalSTRS under the law, and our ability under the law to work to seek remedy, and they remit to us. So that's been our experience thus far. I think we want to get ahead of that before we get to the point where we're missing contributions. We want to identify potentially stressful situations and be talking with people proactively about how to ensure the contributions come in on time. And so that's where building these relationships become important. And I think, as you heard in the last item, Some of the challenge is in arraying information from various sources in a way that we can utilize effectively to monitor the fiscal health. There are lots of areas in the state that do monitor fiscal health of local educational entities, but we need to pull that information together so that we can capitalize on it in terms of being proactive. So the latter part of the item really reflects the results of our discussions with the California Department of Education, the Department of Finance, and the SEO on what are the indicators that we can be looking to. And so then at this point, we're here to answer any questions that you might have.
I don't have anybody in line. Does anyone have any questions of Robin? No. Oh, go ahead, Karen.
Well, I guess I'm looking at the chart on TRB 57. It's pretty small.
Right.
I was trying to make any sense of why, what do we know from this? How do we deal with it? Or do we do anything? Is there a remedy?
So this is a snippet of a chart that we have that's full scale, and it's about 5 feet by 10 feet. So we call it the wallpaper. And it does show every single education entity and their contribution patterns. What we're doing here really is two things. We're looking at variations month to month in reporting, and we need to understand that from a financial reporting perspective because we do revenue accruals. So part of this is to challenge the accuracy of our revenue accruals. The other thing is that if we see variations month to month in what we would call normal school months, we're wondering if our contributions are complete. So again, we talked about that yesterday in terms of the risk with member census data and the fact that we're reliant on the employer to report to us. So this is one of the tools we use to identify whether there could be an issue with the completeness of reporting or whether there may be special compensation that could be misclassified. So it's one of the tools that we use really to do the analytics against the content of the report to make sure that what we're getting is complete and accurate.
Okay, so the color coding is just
It's the variance from month to month. So we measure in units of 5 from 5% to 10% to 15% to 20% variance from month to month. Now, from April to July, somewhere in there is going to be a drop-off, so we understand that. But if you had such a variance between October and November, something there's got to be some kind of explanation. And so what we do with that is we make contact.
Okay.
We take that information, and yes, it's every month I sit with this team and go over those variations so we can understand what's happening.
And at that point, you engage in
We have engaged with the employer to get that information, and we've either discovered that it's rational because of X, Y, and Z, or there may be indications that things were reported incorrectly, which has happened as well, and so they will provide corrected reporting. And in that situation, we work with member account services to make sure that both the district and the county have the right information to do the correct reporting.
And then in that way, you can intervene.
So again, this is trying to switch from just the audit report to more of or the audit process to more of the proactive indicators that there's some kind of differential.
Okay, thank you.
All righty.
Okay.
Paul?
Thank you. Great. Wonderful to see all the work that's done, and it's also nice to know that we've actually not had any failures to remit, so that's good too. I'm just wondering, we've on the internal audit side, we've increased the number of school district audits over the last few years, and I think we've learned a lot. Can you is the work that's being done with the school district audits, does that have provide input into what you're doing and improving what you're doing?
Absolutely, and part of the systemic audit finding process involves analysis of this data to see if we can actually identify those situations where we would expect there was a similar problem. So we might take Larry, help me if I go off track here, but we would take the examples that have been found in the audit, the indicator that it is a systemic problem, and we actually have staff who go in and data mine to see if we could identify those problems. So we had a county where there was a county-wide problem, that's what we did there. And then we provide that information to member account services, and they work directly with the employer to make sure that those adjustments are coming in. Now, obviously, we can't be 100% certain, we're relying on indicators, but that definitely works in terms of that. We also look for things that they find in employers that they haven't audited. So part of what we're doing is we're picking a random sample on a monthly basis, and we look for things that tend to show up as systemic issues in audit so that we can capitalize on that. And again, it's not, so we can mine the data and then share that with other parts of the organization so they can go and either validate or remediate those errors.
All righty. Anyone else? Thank you, Paul. Robin, thank you. And your team also. All righty. Moving right on. Ashish, Andrew, come on up. Let's talk about Penson Solution.
That little project.
Yeah, that little project we have going.
Good morning.
Hello.
Okay, so since we presented in the last July board meeting, the team is working very hard to understand and mitigate the risk we presented to you. For that, we pull out a lot of lessons learned. We discussed with the outreach, the community, the pension fund, our teams, the oversight. We are adding all those lessons learned, not in the PowerPoint, but we are putting in the implementation plan as we discussed in the past. We believe we are taking all these steps to take care that how we can get a achievable schedule and ultimately the successful project. I really appreciate, and we really appreciate that Karen, reached out to us for the demo. In there, I think the team was very happy to provide the demo, and the continuous support and interest you're giving, just feeling good about it, that this is a big, complex project, and we need attention from you, and the team is very appreciating. So here, with what we did, we gave you a good write-up in there, try to paint the picture that what is happening in the project. So here we will go, Andrew and I, what the key challenges we are having in the project, what the current status in the project. The CGI presented a new schedule. We'll discuss about that one, how we are validating, and what initiative we are taking to mitigate those risks, and what effort we are making for the outreach community. So first, I think that some of you raised that what phases and the functional rollouts looks like. So this graphics will give you a little context how they are related to each other. As you know that we started the phase 1 when we signed the contract in 2015. That's our planning phase. So we're done with that. And then in second phase, we did the conceptual design in 2016. In the third phase, we built the infrastructure. And the fourth phase is our all where the functional rollouts, all the business implementation will be happening in this phase. And we are currently in this phase 4. And then the last phase is the transition. So in this project, with the start to end, we have 5 phases. Phase 4 is where we'll have all the rollouts. From FR1 to FR4, this is the member life cycle, what we started with. With that, is any question about phases and function rollout? I think sometimes we just say, okay, function rollout 2, confuse sometimes a phase 2, what does that mean? So we thought that maybe we'll give you a picture that this will resonate to you, that what is the difference in between. And currently we are in the phase 4, and where we have the bulk of the meeting in this phase.
Yeah, we had this illustration put up here because when we were briefing you and Sharon, and then we had
Yeah.
conversations with Joy and Betty and Lynn subsequently, but it came up specifically when we were discussing it with you because we were talking about what payment milestones and deliverable dates were tied to. And we had payment deliverables tied to some of these phases, and that gets confusing when we're talking about phases 1 through 3, particularly when phase 3, 2, and 3 overlap with functional rollout design and those payment milestones.
Thank you, Cassandra.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about what success looks like. And if, as we're going through this presentation, you have any questions about some of the terminology that we're using, please go ahead and stop and ask us to explain. We've included a glossary in the write-up. Hopefully that was helpful. In terms of success, it's important that we internally at CalSTRS are aligned on what, success looks like and that we have a clear vision for that. And so really what we're looking for is a solution that is flexible, that allows us to incorporate legislative changes rapidly, that automates manual processes that are currently manual, that we gain workflow capabilities, that we're able to enhance the member interaction with CalSTRS, and that we are also able to enhance our internal control framework, and that will provide us with the analytics and reporting that you heard Robin talking about and David and Rick, so that we have the kind of information that we're able to use to provide analytics. And then when it comes to some of the key challenges, Ashish?
So I think we discussed in the July board meeting, we were experiencing a significant delay in FR1 due to the complexity in the bridging, synchronization of data, the quality deliverables, and some resource issue. So I think we just thought that we just lay out what are the key challenges we were facing, we're still facing in some areas, which Andrew will go a little further.
Yeah, sure. So for the functional rollout 2, what we're looking at in terms of a challenge is that design is taking longer than we had initially anticipated due to the depth and breadth of our business requirements and the number and type of things like benefit payments that we have. There's a lot going on in functional rollout 2. It is by far the largest of the rollouts, so that is causing us to take more time than we had initially anticipated. I'd also like to mention that some of the decisions that we made about the project years ago are sort of bubbling up again in terms of now that we've been with our vendor and working through this project for 2.5 years, we're looking at some of the decisions that we made and re-examining them in light of what we know today and what makes sense going forward. So in terms of customization, there's a lot of information on the slide. I don't want to read it to you. I think what's important to kind of frame this conversation is kind of taking a step back. So CalSTRS opted to implement an off-the-shelf product as opposed to doing a custom build. So in selecting an off-the-shelf product, we know that there's a certain amount of customization that we're going to need to do in order to meet our business requirements. And our vendor also envisioned a certain amount of customization when they bid on this project. And one of the things that we're engaged in right now as a risk mitigation activity is doing sort of a more refined look at what those gaps are. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. In terms of some of the key drivers for customization, things like our California laws and regulations, those are things that are different from state to state, and so those are things that the system is going to need to be tweaked in order to meet our business needs. There are also high-volume processes. CalSTRS is, of course, very large. So when it comes to things like service retirements or death or payroll, those are extremely high-volume processes for which we may need customization. And then finally, another driver that I'm seeing is, sort of the risk and internal control framework. There might be something that's not necessarily high volume. However, because of the risk associated with that process, we may need to explore customization. So in terms of the project status and where we're at today, with functional rollout 1, we had to move some of the resources from FR2 to support FR1 testing. When we came to you in July, we talked about some of the delays in testing. The good news is that we are working through some of those challenges, and as you can see, employer reporting data fallout has decreased. We are also experiencing greater success with data conversion. Specifically, we've converted 2.5 million member records and 300 million contribution lines. So that is a success and something that we are pleased about. Also, with business transformation efforts, so as you know, we spun up a new business area specifically to handle all of the work that comes along with organizational change management, employee readiness, employer readiness, and that team, with the help of some expert contract assistance, is gaining traction and really starting to implement on the ground some of the activities that we know we're going to need to have in place and mature when we get ready to cut over to our new system.
Okay, so this, in the end of July, we received another re-estimated schedule. As you see, we started in 2015 with the contract in August, in this second column. That's our contract date when we signed the contract. We did the baseline after we understand a little bit better about the requirement. The baseline last year, 2016, December 2016, shift 676 we call, 6 months shift in the functional rollout 1 and 7 months in FR2 and 6 months in FR3. The end of July, again, the re-estimation done in the project, and CGI proposed a new schedule, which is again shifting the overall project as well as individual functional routes. So we didn't approve this estimation, the new one. What we did, we'll explain that one in the fit gap analysis. What happened when we asked the team, our team, the oversight and CGI to work together and say, what do you guys think about the achievability and how much confident you are that this is the final schedule we are getting? Because we just received in 6 or 8 months back a other one in December 2016. So what confidence level you have that we can meet this? And we raised some concern that the contingency is not there. FR2, just like Andrew mentioned, is our biggest rollout. Is like complexity is like 2 or 3 times more than FR1. So we say that maybe we need to have a discussion that what we can do, what kind of approach we are taking. So we are looking in this, I think you know that 90 days fit gap analysis, what's working, what's not working, what other approaches we can take to mitigate the risk. Otherwise, it's every 6 months you will just come and say, we need more time. So this we will discuss a little bit in there, what initiative we are taking.
So as Ashish said, when a new proposed schedule was delivered to us on July 31st, we took the opportunity to dive in and do some real kind of analysis and work. And so with FR1, we're continuing to carefully monitor testing to prevent any further schedule slippage. With FR2, what we've done is conduct a series of what we're calling fit gap sessions, and this is kind of looking at our requirements, and especially the design requirements that have yet to be gone through with the second functional rollout. So we've got about 50% of FR2 design left remaining. And that's really the focus of these fit gap sessions, is to carefully go through the remaining requirements and understand where those gaps are and where the fits are, so that we can make appropriate decisions to lower risk and increase the chances of a successful implementation. With FR3, we plan to conduct a similar exercise in the future. And we're also through a track that we're calling process improvements. We're looking at potentially, what we can do from an implementation perspective, as Ashish just mentioned, to reduce overall risk of a successful implementation.
We also discussed this one in July, that we raised the concern to the corporate CGI. They sent a few folks here to do the assessment of the project. And they came up with initiative, what course correction CGI has to make. There are few areas which is jointly we both has to work on. So currently, what the fit gap is happening, we are also in parallel doing those initiatives to come up to speed. By end of December, we'll have the plan, the action plan, what we will be doing to achieve, to get a achievable schedule and to make this project successful. Yeah.
Thank you, Dana. I really appreciate the report, and I have a question about the customization. And I know that, the 20% customization was the original estimate. And as you're going through the fit gap analysis and finding needs to further customize, are you able to do that on the back end without sacrificing any quality?
So I think the board and us, we already agreed upon the quality is number one. So we are not compromising quality. What we have to do, we have to sequencing our, the events. What the module will go first, then second. I think that's the message we are giving, that we had to course correction in there, that if something is that processing we are hearing is a big item, in which area is a manual intervention, which is the complex, maybe we have to do the sequencing in the right form, not just compromising in the quality.
I think the customization that was included in the contract was actually a little bit higher than 20%. It was probably around 25%, give or take 1 or 2% on either direction. One of the things that we do have to recognize is we have to decide at what point, and I think this is what Ashish is saying, at what point do we want to make the changes or enhancements in the system? So we might have to implement the functionality of the system with some functionality that currently exists that might not exist in the new system right out of the gate, and choose to make that enhancement later on in the process, so that we can get the system in place and have a stable system, making sure that we've met all of our core business requirements to meet our, what we need to do legally, and then enhance it as we move forward into stabilization.
And would those enhancements be part of the contract, or would, once you implement fully, you pay the vendor and then it would be another add-on contract after that?
I think that that's going to be part of the negotiation process, because the vendor bid a whole host of requirements that we had requested. Now we're trying to decide how much does that change the system out of the box? Because we had agreed to move forward with an off-the-shelf product with as limited customization, as possible. But if now understanding what the system performs to, does having it change out of the box right out of the gate up front, does that move us into a larger customization? So if we decide to wait on one of the enhancements or customization pieces that they bid on, then we would expect a credit if they bid that they were going to do that right up front, or we would be having to negotiate. And if there's something that we need right up front, and we didn't understand that we needed it at the time of the contract negotiation, we would have to negotiate that as well. And one of the examples is the actuarial mortality table that we now are going to be needing to implement, that we didn't know that we needed when we drafted the RFP, because we weren't using it at the time. So we'll be looking at what things that we decide that we want to wait on, and what things we absolutely need now, and negotiate those through the change request process.
Okay, thank you.
Cassandra kind of touched on this, but I guess I just wanted to confirm that as you're looking at the items that we want to consider or have considered for customization, I think one priority is looking at the changes that we're required to make because of board decisions or changes in the law. And then I think the other, Andrew, that you mentioned is looking at functions that we do that are high volume, where even if it potentially adds complexity to the customization process, it's something that may deserve to be on that list, because not doing it means it's heavily manual, and that's not a path we may want to go down. So it's really prioritizing how you're looking at what you customize.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, there are certain things that might add complexity, but because it's a highly manual process and it's automated in Start Today, in order to build a manual workaround, that would take a significant number of staff. So weighing those costs and benefits is the activity that we're engaged in.
Super.
Okay, yeah, so this is the risk mitigation initiative slide, and I kind of want to walk you through this because this is something that we've got dozens and dozens of folks in the building at all levels of the organization, as well as our vendor partner, CGI, engaged in for sort of a period of at least 3 months. And what we're doing is, it's so top left box, CalSTRS FR2 Fit Gap Expectations sessions. These are internal sessions with CalSTRS. And this is, again, you know, kind of going back to the beginning of the presentation when we talked about what does success look like. So this is building that shared, aligned vision within CalSTRS between the various business areas to make sure that we're going into design sessions as a unified team and not sort of, as we get into that remainder of FR2 design, coming from different places within the organization so that CalSTRS speaks with one unified voice. And then when we get into the actual fit gap sessions, again, we've got that unified voice, and Team CGI is explaining to us specifically what the solution does out of the box. And then, you know, there's this other zone of kind of, here's how we can configure the system to meet your business needs. And then if there's still a gap, that's when we get into a customization conversation. In parallel with that fit gap activity, we've got, you know, you're looking at this yellow box on the bottom, CalSTRS and CGI mitigation initiatives. These are ideas that we're contemplating to see if we can, again, to kind of what Ashish said a little bit earlier about reimagining our approach to implementation. Are there things that we can do that we thought we absolutely needed to have at some point in this 5-year implementation? Maybe we can look at, you know, moving it from FR2 to FR3, or maybe we can look at, as Cassandra just said, enhancing the system after we go live and have stabilized, and we can, you know, do those pieces of functionality that were initially, years ago, imagined to be part of the original implementation. And then when we get through that kind of 90-day, beginning September 1 activity, we're going to go into the scope, cost, and schedule development, which is really the negotiation piece that you heard Cassandra refer to just now. So ongoing outreach involving large IT modernization efforts. We wanted to be responsive to your questions around what kind of outreach we have been doing. There was a lot of outreach that occurred before the RFP went on the street. CalSTRS is doing a lot of due diligence, contacting other state agencies, contacting not just agencies in California, but across the U.S. And then since the project began, for example, with the evaluation team. So there were a number of us who were on the evaluation team. This was when I was the director of what used to be retirement readiness. And we traveled to a couple of different systems that had implemented Sagitech and talked to them about the solution and, you know, sort of what their experience was going through it. And other efforts that we've been doing, I think Ashish would like to speak to as well.
So we reach out to the lot of big IT large project, you know, in here as well as Obamacare, you know, the EDD, CalPERS. We did the case study. We implemented so many things in our project. We also did in IT community. I reach out to Gartner, Forrester, KPMG, Deloitte, Grant Thornton, not about only the pension related, but is general IT large project. You know, what lesson learned we can learn from the failure as well as the success. There are few areas which there's some projects, I think you hear about all the time unsuccessful project, but there are a lot of successful projects in town as well as in outside of California. So we reach out try to get whatever we can, information we can implement in there. So the topic is here, we just listed a few, but we just go, we know 70 or 80% project fail because of the quality is not there. I was talking to Joy yesterday, and we just say, if the 70, 80% project is just have the same characteristics why they failed. But some 20, 30% is always unique to the individual, the project. Recently we reached out to the Amy Tong, state CIO, had a very good meeting. Cassandra, I met with her, and she came last week here. We provide the overview, and she's very supportive that, whatever help we need. So we reach out to the other agency as well as the other pension fund. We reach out to the neo-spin community that we can form a community in there. If something is in their framework, they can extend. We don't have to customize in our system.
Okay, so next steps. CalSTRS and Team CGI are engaged in a number of activities that we've talked about, around the fit gap process, where we're looking to, again, clarify design in an effort to streamline the schedule moving forward, and then that improvements track that we talked a little bit about that reimagines our approach to the system implementation. And following those exercises, as I mentioned, we're going to be going through a negotiation process to determine what the appropriate scope and schedule and budget will be moving forward. And our goal is to return to you in February with a detailed action plan that, as the slide says, will include outcomes for activities we've been talking about, plus the recommendations for our path forward and any contract amendments if necessary.
Super, Ashish and Andrew, thanks for bringing us up to date with what's going on. Is there any other questions from the board? Okay, seeing none, we'll talk with our consultants then.
Okay.
And see what they have to say
Thanks
about
so
what's
much.
going on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ashish. Thanks, Andrew.